Legends of Blood, Book 1, Prologue. "The makers are gone, and they're never coming back," said the oldest and wisest wolf of the pack, an individual sometimes referred to as Elder. Since the death of his mate and former alpha, most had taken to calling him Alpha. That was how it worked in the pack. Had he not been still alive, the title would have been passed on to one of his pups, a decision made by trial of blood. Whichever heir survived combat with his other pups would make themselves alpha when he was gone. Or there was always the potential that a challenger would beat all of the heirs for the role. But he wouldn't be alive to care by that point. Elder was not a large or powerful wolf. His coat was mostly silver gray and white, a sign of a canine who was close to the end of his life. His body was slender and scarred, riddled with further indications of his age. Despite his clear appearance of fragility, his mind was still sharp, and he ruled with no less ruthlessness than an alpha that had come before him. He had many times claimed to have been alive for long enough to witness the day that the sun had spilled over and swallowed the world, just as he had claimed to once know a maker who had been kind rather than cruel, a giver rather than a thief and devourer. Not all of the pack believed him, but some listened when he told his stories. Today was one such day of storytelling. Elder sat in the shade of an ancient oak, a tree old enough to still show scars from the maker's tools. Directly above his head were a set of orange lines that crossed over one another on the bark of the tree, a strange mark left by the same beings that had wounded it. The makers had once tried to cut the tree down. Elder had long ago told the pack, but they had been stopped by nature. Nature was a strange thing, hardly categorizable with specific words. Some wolves thought of her as a protector, some form of spirit or watcher who was no less canine than them. Others considered her to be in everything, a guiding force rather than an active being. Perhaps she was the one who made the seasons pass and put them into measurable cycles. That was how Elder thought of her. The old wolf leaned against the old tree with a tired huff, feeling its rough bark bite into his back. Bark that reminded him of a little story that No, they had already heard that story enough times, and too many wolves were skeptical of it anyways. He would tell it another time, he conceded, when there were more pups among his audience. Tales of monsters always went over better with the pups. As it was, today was a day when a mixed group had come to listen to him. His eyes had lenses that were faded, just as he was faded by all that he had lived through. He had long ago surpassed the days of strength and youth, and though nature had given him many gifts, as far as what he could do, he was still old, too old. However, with faded eyes gleaming, he turned his attention back upon the wolves gathered before him, and somehow felt slightly younger, as though their presence alone was beneficial to him. Nearest him and the tree were 5 pups, but he was certain that there should have been more. Nature had not been kind to them that season, and though he knew that most of the young were still hidden within dens, it still concerned him to see so few present. Nevertheless, there would come another opportunity, eventually, another chance to once more ensure the future of the pack with another generation. Beyond the pups were 4 adult and young adult individuals who were probably there to watch the pups more so than they were there to listen. The pups, however, remained captivated even after he hadn't spoken for several moments. Of the 5, the most clearly interested, was also the nearest to him, though Elder had a feeling that she had moved closer since her arrival. The pup was a small female with a thick coat made from mostly black fur on her lower half and face, with dark gray on her front and a spattering of gray dapples across her body. Her eyes were like ice, colder and fiercer than they should have been at her age, and one ear was slightly torn from a past scuffle. Her name was Leopard, a name of a distant animal from a distant place, but a fitting name nonetheless. "Where did the makers go?" asked Leopard, keeping her eyes trained on Elder. One dark-furred paw tapped on the ground as she spoke, either from nervousness or impatience, though Elder figured it was the latter. "Far from here," the Alpha replied, his voice soft and certain. He looked first at her and then at the other pups, who had all once again become invested, save for a brown and white furred male who was too busy focused on the distant vocalizations of a bird to pay any further attention. Elder looked back at Leopard. "The makers have gone to the places where the dead are, too far away to ever return. Even the most distant of other packs know of no living makers." The pup furrowed her brow. That was a satisfactory answer, or at least as satisfactory of an answer as Elder was capable of providing, but she still wanted to know more. Her paw tapped on the ground again, first once, then twice. That time, it could be nervousness. "What about the other packs? Where are they?" "Distant," answered Elder, looking away at no place in particular. "But they are of no concern. Most are made up of rogues, loners, dangerous, but so far from us as to be harmless. However, they do not believe as we do. They do not value what we do, and they do not worship as we do." He paused to shake his head. "None are as civilized as us. A few would not be aptly described as savage brutes, ignorant to nature's yearnings. They reside in the places once controlled by the makers, and are no less ravenous in their consumption, and no less bloodthirsty in their wars. To them, blood alone matters." Chapter 1. The makers are gone, and they're never coming back. Leopard repeated Elder's words so long ago spoken, attempting to reassure herself more than anything. She stood alone atop a rocky ridge that overlooked a deep valley in which stood a great gathering of structures built by the makers. The constructs were distant things, varying in size and shape, but they still made her slightly nervous, even though no one had seen the makers in many cycles. Her right paw impulsively tapped the stone beneath her, sending a shower of pebbles down the steep slope. She was older than she had been when she had first listened to Elder's tales of makers and monsters. So much had changed. She had seen 3 cycles since then, which made her old enough to be self-sufficient, but definitely not old enough to be wandering on her own. As for how that came about, she liked to think that she had chosen to leave the pack rather than been kicked out. It also wasn't entirely her fault that Elder's death had left the role of Alpha open to anyone willing to kill enough heirs to get it. A set of scars on her left shoulder and back, as well as a few new notches in her ear, told how well that had gone. But it was all right. That was fine. She preferred being alone. Not that she had a choice. And it gave her an opportunity to make something of herself, far from the control of her old pack. She drew in a deep breath through her nose, and let it out through her mouth. Doing so allowed her to take in what scents were available to her. Nearby there were hares and a faint stench of a bear. Carried in the wind that rolled through the valley and up through the ridges were the vague scents left behind by unfamiliar wolves marking their borders. That was why she was really here, because of the other packs that she had heard so much about as a pup. And if the strangers truly valued blood alone, then she would give them more than enough blood to get what she wanted. If her experiences in the pack had taught her anything, it was that the only real loyalty was earned through conflict. She took in another breath, this time not to smell anything, but rather to ensure that she entered this with a level head. She would go down and explore the places that the makers had made with the hopes of finding more wolves. That was the plan. Elder had said that the distant packs lurked among the constructs left behind by the makers. Words that she sincerely hoped were true. If he had somehow been wrong about the distant packs, then he could have been wrong about the makers. "They're gone," she spoke again, though her words were heard by only herself and the rocks. She cast her gaze towards the cerulean sky, taking in the sight of distant clouds that rose like mountains made from snow. She then looked down the dark stone beneath her, watching the cracks and counting the imperfections. Her paw tapped the rock first once, then twice. "You're scaring yourself again," she muttered, before raising her head to gaze out at the distant cluster of structures. Between her and them was a stretch of open land with scattered shrubs and the occasional trees. The trees were a tall pine with thin leaves, far different from the forests of oak that had been her home as a pup. She had come a long way, and it would be all for nothing if she couldn't bring herself to keep going. She growled at herself, low and frustrated, before digging her claws into the cracks of the outcrop. "Let's do it then," she said to herself, using her powerful paws to push off the stone and propel herself forward. Her body passed beyond the edge of the ridge, and there was a brief instant in which she experienced a sensation of free fall before landing on the dirt slope that led to the fields. The ground was hard and unforgiving, and her paws hit it with enough force to bruise, but not enough to break anything. She winced, clenching her teeth as she started to involuntarily slide down the incline, lowering her body to be closer to the ground and spreading out her limbs in order to avoid falling over. She could have tried running down it, but she didn't want to risk tripping on one of the many stones that littered the slope and severely hurting herself. An injured wolf that couldn't hunt would quickly become a dead wolf, or so she had been taught. The desperation brought about by starvation was far more frightening than anything else her mind could conjure, except for perhaps the return of the makers. According to Elder, the makers had been capable of turning forests to fields and poisoning prey in rivers. She was not afraid of strangers, for wolves were creatures that could be understood. She understood them. The makers, however, were unknowable. Though she had only heard stories, she had learned enough to know that she should fear them more than any other animal. The makers alone could challenge the will of nature, although nature had finally won out in the end, or so she had been told. She guessed that she would find out soon enough whether the makers were really gone or not. Her paws touched down on the flat ground beyond the slope, and she stood to her full height, shaking herself off to remove any dirt that may have clung to her coat on the way down. She then took her first careful step into the unknown ahead of her. She moved as quickly as she could through the shrubland while still maintaining an air of stealth. She kept her ears perked and alert, not wanting to be caught off guard if an unfamiliar wolf decided to attempt an attack. Being downwind of the distant cluster of structures allowed her to get an approximate idea of what she could expect, but the scents were hardly promising. The shrubs around her stank of markings left by coyotes, drowning most everything out. Coyotes weren't a concern to her, not during the day at least. The canines were smaller than wolves, but they were swift and vicious. They primarily hunted at night and were more than capable of killing a lone wolf if there were enough of them. Sleeping in coyote territory was a mistake that she had made early on in her journey, a mistake that she would not repeat. Fortunately, there was more than enough time left in the day to explore the place of the makers and find a suitable location to spend the night. The scents left by coyote activity began to diminish as she neared a loose gathering of the same tall trees that she had spotted from atop the ridge. The trees had a reddish-brown bark that was flaking off in some places, and one that looked like it had been struck by lightning, leaving its branches dead and much of its trunk without any bark at all. High above, nestled among the appendages of a dead pine, was a nest made from intertwined twigs and branches. The nest, though large, looked like it had been abandoned, as there was no equally large avian there to guard it. An empty nest and a dead tree were hardly good signs, not according to any of the traditional wisdoms that had been passed on to her by Elder. She had been taught to revere nature and accept certain things as a warning of what has yet to come. Heeding such warning was a part of what had kept her alive so far, just as her instincts had guided her since her departure from the pack. As it was, every instinct and scrap of knowledge that she had earned were now telling her to turn back. However, the faint scent of other wolves on the wind drew her on, promising everything that she had ever desired. She had passed beneath the ruined tree without giving it a second glance. She wasn't going to let such premonitions stand in the way of what she wanted to do, and yet she couldn't deny the terrible feeling that she had done something irreversible as she walked underneath the branch that held the nest. She shook her head to clear those thoughts and focus on what was ahead of her. Visible from where she was, separated only by another stretch of low grass and sparse vegetation, was the first of the maker-built things. A boxy structure with walls made from what looked like yellowish stone. She would have to get closer to be sure. Another step brought her nearer to the structure and farther from the trees and the mountainous ridge where she had started. She didn't look back, though, fearing that she may be tempted to turn around. The makers were gone, and she had to keep reminding herself. As she neared the corner of the structure, it had become apparent that it had a sloped covering of rough material over top of it, as well as several square openings in its side that had once been filled by thin sheets of clear material. However, the clear panels were all either cracked or shattered, and creeping tendrils of ivy had grown over the stone of the walls. It had looked abandoned, just as Elder had claimed. Sniffing the air added additional certainty to her thoughts. The only scents were the unfamiliar wolves, much closer now but still distant, and the nearby scent of a hare. That was all. There was no undefinable creature that could have been the makers. Raising up on her hind legs and bracing herself against the stone allowed her to look through the cracked panes of clear stuff and view the interior of the structure. It was mostly dark within, and various unrecognizable constructs lay on the ground. Even sniffing there only revealed decay and the activities of small animals, no makers. Maybe that was it then. Maybe Elder had been right. Then again, Had he ever been wrong? She shook her head, chuckling to herself as she found some semblance of humor in that which she had previously feared. After a final scan of the interior of the structure, she hopped back down and continued to follow the wall, keeping close to it. Now that she had all but confirmed that there were no makers present, she felt a little bit more confidence return to her. She just had to stick to her plan, and the moment that she had been meticulously planning for over a cycle would be upon her. Alpha, they would call her, and no one would ever be able to force her out again. She rounded the corner at the edge of the structure and beheld many more that were much like it, all arranged around an overgrown path made from gravel. Though the other constructs varied in size, shape, and color, all had in common an appearance of abandonment. Plants had grown across their facades, and many had cracks present in the stone. They had been abandoned. She took to following the gravel as she traveled deeper into the land that had been built upon by the makers. A forest was a good way to describe it, a forest of structures whose owners had long left them. Most would have been suitable for dens due to how sheltered they were, which gave her further hope that she'd be able to find more wolves here. The scents were getting slightly stronger too, growing as she walked along the path of gravel, though the sharp stones bit into her paws with every step. The path offered the best possible view of the surrounding structures so that she could keep an eye out for strangers that she was smelling. The wind was fortunately in her favor, so she would have some sort of warning if anyone approached, but she wanted to be sure. As she carefully advanced forward, constantly scanning her surroundings, she began to notice that strange markings had been sprayed upon some of the walls of the structures. The markings were faded, but they reminded her of those that she had seen on the trunk of Elder's tree. Different in shape, but nonetheless similar. A lot of the markings seemed to be ordered in patterns that had surely meant something to the makers that put them there. Maybe they were warnings of some kind, much like the empty nest and ruined tree, or perhaps they had simply been put there as a way of not being forgotten. However, nature cared not for the symbols of the makers, as evidenced by the fact that many were covered by vines and vegetation. They were not forgotten yet, but they would one day be. Her eyes lingered on a particularly large marking that took the form of a strange two-legged spiral that was surrounded by what appeared to be eyes, before her attention was drawn away by a flash of movement as something moved next to the structure that she was looking at. She immediately froze, staring at the spot with perked ears and quietly sniffing the air. Much to her displeasure, the wind had died down now that she was closer to the heart of the Maker's land, meaning that her nose would be of no use to her in identifying what was over there. If it was a wolf or a coyote, it was probably long gone now that it had presumably spotted her, but she needed to be sure. She lowered herself into a crouch and began to creep towards the corner, attempting to use the minimal vegetation as cover to conceal herself as best as she could. Of course, her dark coat and the openness of the land ensured that such measures were surely pointless, but she couldn't be too careful either. If she got lucky, it could be something to eat, or someone whose blood was hers to spill. She was getting close to the place where the movement had been, and she did what she could to keep down the sounds of her breathing. She still couldn't see around the corner, and she wouldn't be able to until she was directly upon it. If something was waiting for her beyond, it would have the benefit of surprise. With that in mind, she decided that the moment she saw what was there, she'd go for the throat. A stranger could fight back, but she was confident that she could take on any single wolf or coyote. However, she wouldn't feel safe until her teeth were through the neck of whatever had apparently been watching her. She reached the point just before turning the corner and hesitated. Her paw tapped the ground, but she only managed to get one tap out before she willed herself to act. She threw herself forward with front paws out and jaws open wide, intending to turn the odds in her favor by surprising whatever was there. Rather than connecting with the furred flesh of an animal, she merely hit the ground hard and skid to a stop. There was nothing there. She quickly realized, except for a square piece that had looked like it had fallen from the roof of the structure, that was all it had been. "You're getting paranoid, Leopard," she chastised herself, approaching the little chunk of brownish material to confirm that it was but a harmless fragment of the Maker's construct. She managed to smile at her own foolishness, drawing in a breath that she intended to let out in a sigh of content. She didn't get that far, as the overwhelming stench of a fresh scent marker from an unfamiliar male wolf caused her to choke on her own inhale. The next sensation that she felt was that of a body slamming into her side, knocking her to the ground. Maybe she hadn't been paranoid after all.